Today's discussion on the Constitution has us revisiting some things about the three branches of government and also considering why those three branches of government are important for us today and why they were important in the eyes of the founders who wrote the Constitution. So, first things first, I was going through a number of your questions and saw that there were some good questions that you might want to know the answers to. So, let's answer those questions first. And you might recognize your question being in this slideshow in some way. So, the first question is about how old you need to be in order to be a member of Congress. And there's actually two different answers for that because it depends on the office you're going to hold, whether you're going to be a senator or a representative in the House of Representatives. So, the first article of the Constitution is divided into a number of different articles. And Article 1 specifically deals with the legislative branch. And you have to be 25 years old, according to Section 2 of Article 1, in order to be a representative. There's also a citizenship requirement that says that you have to be a citizen for 7 years. And you also have to live in the state you represent. Senators, on the other hand, have to be 30 years old and a citizen of the United States for 9 years. They also have to be a member, or a resident rather, of the state that they represent. The presidency, on the other hand, there's another requirement to be a president, and there are three requirements. That the president has the highest age limit. So the president of the United States has to be 35 years old. They have to be a citizen of the United States or a resident here in the United States for at least 14 years. And you have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen, which means you could not have been born outside the United States. Another question came up about the executive branch, asking, how many times can you be elected president? And in the very beginnings of this country, the Constitution did not say how many terms a president could have. There was no limit on that power. In fact, none of the offices really had term limits associated with them, but you had to constantly be reelected in the legislative and executive branches. Only the judicial branch had a lifetime term limit. The Constitution today has an amendment, meaning that the Constitution was revised from when it was originally written, and the 22nd Amendment was ratified after Franklin Roosevelt was president. And as many of you know, Franklin Roosevelt won four terms as president. He didn't serve all four terms to their full length, so he wasn't in office for 16 years. He was only in office a little bit more than 12 years. And today, the limit is on a two-term presidency. The actual language in the 22nd Amendment says, though, let's say that a president takes over halfway through another president's term. So let's say the vice president were to become president. They can finish out that president's term, and that counts as technically their first term. And if they've served less than 2 years as the president, they can run 2 times and serve up to a maximum of 10 years. However, if the vice president becomes president, say only a year into that first president's term, he's been president for 3 years, he can only be elected once more. And when I say he, it could also be a she, because there is no restriction on who can be president. Really good question about the functions of the vice president and what he or she really does. So the vice president is that backup person, and they take over the presidency if ever needed to. So one way that happens is that under the 25th Amendment, there's always got to be a president. So the vice president actually takes over as the acting president. They don't actually become the full president of the United States, but they are the acting president if the president is not able to do their job. So let's say, for example, the president is going to have surgery. It happens, but to have that surgery done, the president is going to be asleep. And because they're asleep doing surgery on the president, you can't just run into the president and say, there's something really wrong. We need you to, wake up and do something right now. So the vice president acts as the president for the time that the real president is not able to do their job. The vice president is also a diplomat and can go to foreign countries and meet with different leaders on behalf of the United States if the president or any ambassadors are unable to do so. The vice president is also considered under the Constitution the president of the Senate. And we've seen a number of times when the vice president goes into the Senate to cast a tie-breaking decision. A question about impeachment and who becomes president. So there are different people who do come in to take over the office of the presidency. The first person is the vice president, and that has been in the Constitution since the very beginning. So the vice president is automatically president, and then the vice president's office has no person in it. The Senate then has to appoint, or confirm rather, a new president or vice president. So the vice president is president and nominates a new person to take over as vice president. And that person goes in front of the Senate and has to be confirmed to the office, meaning they have to receive a majority of the votes. Now, if something were to happen and the vice president were also unable to take over as president, there's a whole line of potential people who could take over as president of the United States. And that includes the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who's the leader in that particular part of Congress. And today that's Nancy Pelosi. The president of the Senate, or the president pro tempore, meaning for a temporary period of time, if the vice president is not acting as the president of the Senate or the leader of the Senate, there is one senator who has that position today, who is the leader of the Senate. And they would then take over. And then there's the different secretaries of the various cabinets. Remember, the different advisors to the president. And they get their position in this line in the order of how their department was created. So the Secretary of State, the State Department was created first to advise President Washington. Therefore, the Secretary of State would become president first in that list of advisors. And then the Secretary of the Treasury, Defense, the Attorney General. There's actually a list of a number of individuals who would take over after the Attorney General. And this is another reason why the appointments to these different cabinet positions have to be confirmed by the Senate, because of the possibility that if something were to happen to a bunch of people in government, that one of them could inevitably become president. So if the president were to become impeached, could they technically run for office again? And this was a really tough question, but the answer to that is yes. So a president or vice president or any government official can be impeached and removed from office if they're convicted, meaning they're found guilty. If they're guilty, they have to leave office immediately. They can't hold the office anymore. However, the rule in the Senate is that you do not have to be barred or forbidden from holding office again in the future. Removal from office is the immediate consequence that has to happen because that's named in the Constitution. But it is an option of the Senate to forbid you from holding office again. A good question for the executive branch about who chooses the vice president. And in the beginning of the United States, the president and vice president were chosen by the voters. And the way it worked out was the president was the person who ran and got the most votes. The vice president was going to be the person who got the second most votes. Now, if you were two people who were running against each other for president, chances are you didn't always see eye to eye on a number of issues, and you might have had very, very different opinions. So they didn't always agree. For example, in one of the earlier presidencies, we had John Adams was the second president of the United States, and his vice president was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the runner-up. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, even though they worked together on creating and establishing the United States, they really did not see eye to eye. So that was a president-vice president combination that really didn't get along too well together. So an amendment is going to be passed early on, or ratified early on, that says that the president of the United States and the vice president would run together. And the only rule was that they couldn't be from the same state. So in the most recent presidential election in 2016, we had, yes, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were presidential candidates from the state of New York. That was allowed. However, both of their vice presidential candidates were not from New York and could not have been from the state of New York. So we had Hillary Clinton choose Tim Kaine as her running mate, and Tim Kaine was from the state of Virginia. Donald Trump from New York chose Mike Pence, who was from Indiana. So therefore, two different states were represented on the presidential ballot. So those candidates, both Trump and Hillary Clinton, chose their own running mate or their vice presidential candidate. So that's how the vice presidents are chosen together. They're elected together as a package deal. Now we move over to the judicial branch, and there was a question about, has anyone ever, passed away while being a Supreme Court justice, since they can technically serve for life? And the answer to that is yes, it's happened a number of times. In more recent history, we had a past Chief Justice who passed away, and that paved the way for John Roberts, who's the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to be elevated to that position. And then more recently, Antonin Scalia passed away towards the end of President Obama's presidency, and that allowed President Trump to have one of his Supreme Court nominations. A lot of times, though, justices choose to retire when they simply just feel like they don't want to continue serving on the Supreme Court any longer. A good question about the longest serving justice on the Supreme Court, and I had to look this one up. Justices do serve for life, so they can actually be on the bench for a long time. On the court today, the longest serving member is Clarence Thomas. He's been there for 28 and a half years. William Douglas, however, holds the record for the longest serving justice on the court. He retired after serving for over 36 years. The second and third place record holders were on the courts for about 34 years. Now, we talked about age requirements for the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the President. However, the age requirement for the Supreme Court doesn't exist. There is no age requirement, and in fact, the Constitution doesn't even say you have to have a law degree. So realistically, anyone can be nominated to be a member of the Supreme Court. A question about why the number 9. Why are there 9 justices? And it was chosen as a larger number to encompass a number of different viewpoints. And it's an odd number because it avoids having a tie on the Supreme Court. Now, that number has bounced around over the years. At one point, it was 7 justices. It may have swelled at one point to a number like 12 or 15. But today we use 9 justices, and that avoids the tie on the court. We have 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. And finally, we come to these 2 final questions that talk about why are there so many branches of government and which branch of the government is the most powerful. And this brings us to our discussion on checks and balances, which is our lesson today. Under the Constitution, no one branch is supposed to be able to be more powerful than another. Congress has 500 plus individual representatives that represent the different states and people in the United States. The President of the United States represents every single citizen in the United States, and the Supreme Court also represents everyone in all of the United States. So we have a system of checks and balances where the 3 branches have the ability to support one another or to overrule one another. And this is just to make sure that no one branch technically can grab too much power for themselves. So let's take a look at this image from our textbook in a little bit larger here. And yes, it's a little bit blurry, but let's say, for example, Congress writes a law. Well, that bill goes to the president, and the president can choose to veto that bill, meaning the president does not approve that bill and it will not become a law. Well, Congress can get together and override the president's veto. There is a specific number of votes that a bill has to receive in both houses of Congress in order to override the president's veto. So one person, the president, can say no to a law, but if enough people in Congress support a law, that must mean that enough people across the United States support that law, so therefore it will become law anyway, even if the president said no. So the president nominates Supreme Court justices. The Senate has to sit and approve those justices to the Supreme Court. And the way the Supreme Court works as a check on Congress is that if Congress passes a law, the Supreme Court can say, no, that law is unconstitutional. So again, that was a presidential power, that the president can support Supreme Court justices or nominate them. And then the president, if he goes overseas to sign a treaty, those treaties can be overruled as unconstitutional. So let's take a look at this chart here. Now, the way this chart works is the top line here is the first thing that happens. If we go down a little bit further, that's the second thing. And the further down it is, that's the third step that would happen. So Congress passes a law in the legislative branch. The Senate and the House of Representatives agree on a bill that should become law. So that bill has to technically go to the president because it's not a law until it receives the approval of the president. So the president can sign that law into action, and let's say that he or she does sign the law into action. The Supreme Court can turn around and say, that law is unconstitutional. Or the Supreme Court can review a law and say that it does support the Constitution. Now, on the flip side, let's say Congress again passes a law, but this time the president doesn't agree with that law. We said before that Congress can override that veto with a certain percentage of representation. It's not a simple majority, meaning 50% said yes. It's a much higher percentage now. So Congress overrides that veto and the law becomes law anyway. Well, the Supreme Court can still comment and choose to say, yes, that law is good, or no, that law is unconstitutional. Down here, the president can order the military to go into action as the commander-in-chief. However, the president cannot legally declare war. Only Congress can do that, and both houses of Congress declare war in the United States. Congress also controls how the government spends its money. So while the president, yes, can order the military to go into action, Congress has financial controls over the country. So it can choose to not fund certain areas of the government. Since acts of Congress are done by law, so if Congress declares war, the Supreme Court can, rule that as constitutional or unconstitutional. So in the Supreme Court, if there's an empty seat on the court, the president nominates a Supreme Court justice. However, that person doesn't automatically get the job. The Senate has to approve their choice. Let's also say that the president signs a treaty with a foreign country. Congress has to approve all foreign agreements, specifically the Senate approves all treaties with a 2/3 majority. However, the Supreme Court can still overturn that treaty. If part of it does not fall in line with the Constitution, it cannot be considered legal, and the United States is no longer bound to the terms and conditions of that treaty if it violates our own country's laws. And finally, the president might be accused of doing something wrong, and Congress does not work together on the impeachment. There's two separate sections. The first part is the House of Representatives accuses the president, or technically any other government official, of doing something wrong. Then what's called the Articles of Impeachment, gets forwarded to the Senate. And the Senate then has to meet as like a court body, and they are the jury in that trial. So here I've used the example of the president, but it technically can be any other federal official, including federal judges. The Senate has to vote to acquit that person, meaning that they're innocent, or convict that person, meaning that they believe that that individual is guilty. The Chief Justice from the Judicial Branch and the Supreme Court acts as the trial judge in the Senate. So that's how we have checks and balances that work together today. It's a way to protect Americans' freedoms. And the reason why our checks and balances exist in three different branches today is because the founders of our country looked at Great Britain and they said Great Britain really was able to do whatever it wanted without having a lot of input in the decision-making process. You know, think about how quickly the Intolerable Acts became law. The Boston Tea Party happened in 1773 in the very late days of December, and then by April, the Intolerable Acts were law, and by June, were being enforced in the colonies about 6 months later. That's very fast for a law to move. So by having multiple ways of reviewing laws, more people are reviewing it, they're thinking about it, they're commenting on it, and they're giving suggestions for making it a better law for more people in the United States. So the bad thing is that checks and balances seemingly make it look like it takes forever to get a law passed, or that some people might say it's impossible to get anything done. If the president and Congress don't agree, that law might not pass if there's not enough support in Congress to override a presidential veto. However, we could also look at the two houses of Congress itself. If the House of Representatives doesn't have the same viewpoints as the Senate, that law isn't going anywhere either because Congress has to pass a law in both the House and the Senate in order to get out of Congress. So that itself takes a long period of time. So government in the United States is intentionally slow, and laws, in order to become law, are really intended to support the most number of Americans, and they want the government leaders to get their decisions done right rather than too fast, because hasty decisions might not have necessarily resulted in good decisions. For today's assignment, I've copied again something out of our textbook for us to be taking a look at, and then there's one question at the bottom that asks, why are checks and balances important? So feel free to replay this video, review your textbook information, and talk to us today about why checks and balances are important in American government.